Chapter 4. The water in the Olympic-sized pool was refreshingly chilly. With her long hair trailing behind her, Maggie's slim frame was barely covered in an aqua two-piece bathing suit as she floated silently. When Clint joined them, she and Brent had already completed 2 loops parallel to one another. He seldom went swimming with others and never with total strangers. From the middle of his wide, hairy chest to the bronzed skin of his flat stomach, there was a long, jagged white scar. There was another on his toned thigh. He referred to them as souvenirs from a previous battle in which he had not dove far enough to avoid being hit by shrapnel showers. Maggie didn't find them ugly at all. The only aspect about him that unnerved her was the sight of that strong, dark figure devoid of any clothing to soften its sensual appearance. She and Brent never brought up Clint's scars, though, as he was sensitive about them. They spent several minutes talking and unwinding in the soothing water until Emma broke the silence by phoning Brent. Taking his thin body out of the water, Brent moaned, "They find you wherever you go. Maggie, go on without me. If you fall for the 3rd time, Clint will come to your rescue." She whispered, "Want to bet?" But he hadn't heard her. As he surfaced next to her, Clint shook his black head to brush his hair out of his eyes. His thin hands found her naked midriff, and as he drew her body firmly against him and righted her in the water, a wild shiver of desire ran through her lean frame. What was the intended meaning of that crack? With his intense gaze fixed on hers and his powerful legs intertwined with hers beneath the water, he inquired. She said shakily that you'd probably like drowning me. She started to get chills. "Please release me. I'm chilly." Excited or cold? With a serious expression and a searching glance, he posed the query. "Irish, you've always had a thing for Brent, have you not?" "Our relationship is great." "And neither do you and me," he stated firmly. "It should go without saying. Clint." Her palms pressed up on his chest, making contact with the deep scar there. Her gaze dipped to it, concealed beneath a dense tangle of damp hair that was unfamiliar and unsettling to her touch. She touched it lightly with her fingers, then went over the strong, broad chest, still cool from the shower. She yanked her palm away as though his flesh had scorched her, a shock wave coursing through her as she understood what she was doing. Grasping her hand, he raised it to his shoulder and held it there while examining her dejected expression. "Maggie, please don't," he whispered. She whispered, whipping herself into a sorrowful voice. "Not that I intended to." Grabbing a fistful of her damp hair, he pressed her face up against him until her face was buried in the chilly, bronzed flesh, her nose being tickled by the curling hairs. With a deep, peculiar sound in his voice, he muttered near her ear, "My God, I like it when you touch me. Nothing about which to feel guilty. Curiosity is a natural emotion in a woman, especially in her innocence." At her nape, his fingers became tense. She could feel the harsh, heavy pounding of his heart against her under the water. He said, "Come here, honey," and then engulfed her in his arms, bringing the stars down into the water with them. Slowly, as his grip tightened, she was held, crushed, and hurt. "He gave me your mouth," huskily growling. Flaring, hungry, she raised her face to meet his searing gaze and watched in something akin to wonder as they moved to her lips. It was Clint. Her early years were spent as much on the ranch, with the horses, and with Jana, as they were with Clint, who tormented and mocked her. But in all of her crazy, youthful imaginations, it had never been like this. He was an older man than her, with experience and self-assurance. She could read the hunger in his face, and her lack of expertise was no match for it. "And now I'm going to show you sensations you never knew you could feel, "Little innocent," he said roughly, bending his dark head. "I will demonstrate to you the ways of a lady." She was waiting impatiently to feel his strong, sculpted mouth on hers, but she was shivering and helpless. Just as the patio door opened, shattering the magic, she began to talk, to say something, anything at all. When Clint released her and went under the water, she felt a shiver go through his muscular body. Brent sprang into the water with a loud splash, his bare feet thudding on the wet concrete. After Maggie finished reading Clint's short correspondence, which he had left for her on the dictaphone, she went riding with Brent the following day. With a smile, Brent remarked, taking in the verdant woodland surrounding them. "This is where I spent a lot of my early years." She also grinned. "I also did. Remember when Jana and I used to play cowboys and Indians here? Once, from the top of one of those pines, we ambushed you." "And got ticks, you two," he thought merrily. She trembled. It was terrible. No doubt. He paused, scowling as he stared down at her. He questioned sharply, "What got into Clint last night?" She turned her face away as she started to flush. She responded bluntly, bad temper, recalling how he'd walked out of the pool without looking back shortly after Brent had returned. Not long afterward, he had left the home, and Maggie hadn't heard the automobile coming back until early in the morning. Brent had left for work by the time they arrived at the breakfast table. With closed eyes, she remembered what he'd been going to do, what she'd almost allowed him to do. He was still leaning his hard mouth just over hers, and she could still feel the warmth and smoke of his breath blending with hers. She had been so desperate for that kiss that Brent's interruption had seemed like a ripped parting. But this way, she told herself, it was better. It was clear that Clint had all the women he needed. She ought to have been more prepared because he enjoyed making fun of her nevertheless. Maybe with Brent here now. "How are you doing?" With a hand waved in front of her eyes, Brent inquired. She gave him a sidelong glance. "Mars," she theatrically murmured. "Out there, mentally traveling to odd and exotic locations." He smiled. "What if you tried using your lips to explore me?" His eyebrows flickered up and down as he leered. She erupted into laughter and allowed Melody to step alongside his steed. "You're just what I required." "Oh, I'm so happy you made it." "I'm happy that you are," he answered. "By what do you mean?" He gave her a questioning gaze. "Well, Cousin Clint isn't really. Beware, my former leading lady. It is amazing to watch Clint in action." "I'm not sure I get it." He casually told her, "He wants you." Her heart halted, then resumed. "Brent, he's just playing games." Lita tore into his ego and, he said in a low voice, "He wants you." Though I've never seen him look at a lady quite like that, I recognize the purpose all too well. I do not want you to suffer harm. It was reassuring to hear of his concern. She extended her hand to caress his slender arm. She smiled. "I don't want to see me hurt either. I am completely aware of everything. I refuse to put my head in the sand." He smiled back and shook his head. "Despite your fake fiancés, my dear, you've been in love with him for the majority of your life. I see it. He might not." Gazing at the pommel of her saddle, she bit her lower lip. Philip, I assumed, would make up for it? He completed it for her. "You were more aware, weren't you?" "You shouldn't have come here, Maggie." Her laughter was quiet. "It's getting a little late." "When I go, come home with me," he urged softly. Trying to decipher his slender features, she fixed her gaze on him. He laughed. "No, it isn't like that." "Solemn now, Maggie. I know how you feel," he continued. A woman is back at home. She doesn't feel that way about me, even though I'd give everything I had and more. Like you, I am aware that no one else could replace her. This is not how you should be drawn and quartered. We'll comfort one another. Brent, a shoulder to cry on? She said quietly. With more seriousness than she had ever seen in him, he answered, "That's all I can offer you." Abruptly, he smiled. "Did you believe I was proposing a tremendous passion to you?" Her laughter was ferocious. "Allow me to consider it," I promised, "and I'm working on a project right now." He answered, "It's up to you what you do. I never make a conscious effort to meddle in other people's lives. But if you ever need a place to stay, I'm here to provide it. He won't ever find you either." She gave a nod. "I appreciate the choice." He gave her a wink. "Compared to him, you are my cousin more. We used to be two mischievous people." "We still are." She leaned menacingly toward him. "Let's take his Jeep's rotor out." "You're set." Clint cast a sidelong glance at his two naive guests across the dinner table. "I had an unusual experience today," he said nonchalantly. "When I attempted to start my Jeep, the rotor was not there." "The rotor?" Emma cried out, halting as she raised a forkful of mashed potatoes to her lips. Was the rotor missing? Maggie arched her eyebrows and looked directly into Clint's inquisitive eyes. "How peculiar," she stated without emotion. Brent had to excuse himself from the table after strangling on his coffee. "Never be afraid." Maggie got up and called after him. "First aid is en route." Luckily, Brent and she managed to stay out of Clint's way for the next 4 days. Just. However, he was losing his anger more than ever, and preparing for the enormous sale wasn't helping. "Hello, Maggie." The foreman, Billy Jones, called and said, "Clint wants to see you." Glancing up from her work on the veranda, she was preparing a to-do list for the midday BBQ at the sale. "Okay, so here I am," she made a happy call. "Permit him to browse to his heart's desire." Maggie immediately apologized to Billy as he walked away, shaking his head. That morning, Brent had been called away for work, so she was hesitant to push Clint too far without Brent's backing. But she was starting to feel the strain. "And there you are, tiny witch of tormented heart." With a muttered expression, Clint ascended the stairs, his hat cocked over his brow and a hard, angry visage. Even though she was cringing, she raised her gaze. "True?" He came to a halt just in front of her and threw his hat to the nearest table. She was trapped when he reached down and placed one strong arm on either side of her in the large rocking chair with a high back. In a voice that was dangerously gentle, he continued, "If I were you, I wouldn't push too hard. I think I've had enough of you and Cousin Brent." It was unsettling to feel the sheer force in that slender body so close. "Simply because we concealed your rotor." He gave me a fierce growl when I placed pink ribbons around the tails of 2 of my milk cows and added bubble soap to the swimming pool. Her face reddened. At the time, it had been quite humorous. "You have a sense of humor deficit. That's your problem," she complained. "You have sufficient for the 2 of us," he fired back. His eyes were narrow and menacing, like those of a leopard, with a green-gold hue in that swarthy face. She told the open front of his blue-checked shirt, where black curling hair poked out, drenched with sweat, that even as kids, you managed to make us feel like criminals every time we committed a joke. He remembered that a few times you damn near bleached my hair white, and part of his fury left him. He grinned. "Thus," she said, and unintentionally her fingers extended to make contact with the silver at his temples. "Are you positive it's not an indication of advancing age?" Mischievously, she added. He gave a very little laugh. You prick. When he laughed like that, all the years seemed to melt away. He was the Clint of her early years, the mythical, unbreakable creature who made her fantasies come true. Clint, she said, I apologize for the bubble bath, but it did look so pretty. He adjusted a lengthy lock of her hair. Brent has a negative impact on you. Keep your tiny hands off my vehicles from now on. Indeed, Clint, how weak, he scoffed. His gaze fell to her lips and stayed there for a long moment. She let out an involuntary cry as he suddenly grabbed her little waist with both hands and dragged her up against him. Will you let me go, you beast? She let out a furious gasp. He touched her temple with a soft breath. He said in a husky voice fit for a stranger, Irish, it's dangerous to stop fighting me. I'm not used to boundaries of any type. I'm a man, not a youngster like Brent. Do you want me to explain that to you? Or are you too naive to get that? His hands shoved her aside, and she felt the lean, firm body against hers go rigid as she attempted to pick up the pen and paper that had fallen on the floor. She pursed her lips and avoided his observant stare, saying, I seem to remember you're telling me that I didn't appeal to you that way. Between them there was a long, motionless quiet. For Shorty, do you have a list? After a time, he asked, and just as she heard his lighter click, a cloud of smoke began to float about her. Getting those materials today will allow him to begin cooking early in the morning. I'm almost done, she answered, taking a seat again. I intended to get him some plastic cutlery, paper plates, napkins, and tablecloths. You are a thrifty little soul, don't you? With a harsh tone, he inquired, Should I find this impressive? She came back hot, saying that the only thing that could impress you is a steamroller. Definitely more depressing than impressive, he remarked, grinning briefly. She let out a hard sigh. You are without a doubt the most annoying person on the planet. You're really annoying yourself, honey, with your hair hanging loose like that and your eyes looking like early spring green buds, he said. Just watch out that you don't throw any of that delicious magic at Brent. To have to eject him from the property would be unbearable for me, she started. What I do with Brent. With his gaze daring her to dispute, he added plainly, Is my business as long as you're on my ranch. Additionally, avoid the error of underestimating him. Because he's a man, you can playfully tease him in a way that makes it seem just as appealing as a come-on. Her jaw dropped wide open. I have spent my entire childhood playing words with Clint, for crying out loud. It was safe, too, when you were still 8 and he was 10. His emerald eyes skimmed over her slender form, attired in a delicate tan blouse and pants. You've come a long way since your 8th birthday, baby. Refrain from tempting fate. She threw a tantrum at him, saying, How strange that you should be warning me about Brent, when just the other day he was warning me about you. A single eyebrow raised, and she noticed the gleam of mischief in his gaze. He inquired, What did he say? As soon as she grasped what the words were, her mouth opened to pronounce them, then closed again. Her face was scorching hot. He chuckled quietly. He nudged. Well? You understand that? Until you tell me, I won't let that go. Maggie, what did he say? She moved apprehensively. At last, she remarked, he said you were a force to behold. What more is there? She faltered. That was all. He took a long time to study her, casually sketching on the cigarette. He pondered. I think I can guess. To a certain extent, he is correct. I can have any lady I want, darn it. But I don't rob cradles, Maggie, he replied, his voice suddenly gentle. Though tempted to protest, she refrained from opening that bag of worms since she was too intelligent. What is the urgency of this list? Within an hour. Regardless, I have to send Shorty into town to pick up some wire that I ordered. He said, "You'll have to be hostess since Mother won't be back for 2 or 3 more months. Emma is unable to..." He teased, "Honey, nothing keeps buyers happier than a pretty, sexy woman." Words could not match the power of the open look she directed at him. I refused to be employed as a... His warm breath mingled with hers as he leaned down, effectively putting an end to her tirade just by being close. His gaze pierced hers profoundly. He muttered, "It's been 12 years, and you still can't tell when I'm kidding. You are not going to be my bait, and I'll break both of the arms of any man who even slightly touches you. Feeling content?" Her countenance became confused as her eyes grew wider. "Why do you, Clint?" He delicately tapped her nose with his finger. "Complete the list. I have so much work on my plate." With a sudden turn, he left her gaping after him. The next morning, sale day arrived far too quickly as purchasers arrived by plane and automobile. The verdant grounds were quickly blanketed with them. While Shorty was occupied with roasting massive carcasses for barbecue, stirring baked beans, and baking rolls, he was attempting to multitask and was not amenable to assistance from Maggie. He furiously gestured at her flowing white dress and asked how she planned to remove grease stains. She winked and smiled, leaving him to finish. Emma entered shortly after, her apron already smeared and discolored, and began observing the beans. She was nearly kissed by Shorty as he landed on her shoulder. Maggie oversaw the temporary assistants as they set up tables, arranged coffee pots, brewed tea, and brought in tubs of beer and soft drinks. She thought back to her early years and the days of sales, when Mrs. Collins had made everything seem so simple. It was far from that. She looked around the next cubicles involuntarily for Clint, and her gaze found him. While he chatted cattle with an old man next to her, a tall, slim, gorgeous blonde woman clung on to him. The woman had an extremely familiar appearance. She dug through her mind to recall a name. Sarah Willis. At the early age of 9, little Sarah had developed into a siren and was pursuing Clint with the same fervor as Maggie had. Maggie sighed, exhausted. Jana had mentioned that Sarah was on vacation in Europe with her father. It seemed like they were back, so she didn't have to find out who Clint had been seeing lately. That small diamond hand, so possessive, said it all. She redirected her attention to her household tasks, fervently hoping that Brent would have returned in time to provide her with some consolation. It felt more than necessary to her than before. If only she hadn't arrived. "Hello," said a smooth, manly voice from behind. She turned to see a rather handsome man, perhaps 40, standing behind her, dressed in a leisure suit the color of rust. She grinned on autopilot. "Hi there." "Are you ready to make a sale?" she inquired. He beamed at her from below. "That's the reason I came." He laughed and drooled. "However, I've heard that Clint's cousin has already placed an offer on Bighorn." It was the ancient Hereford bull that truly captured my heart. She smiled and apologized. However, Brent also did. "Are you a member of the family?" She gave a headshake. "I'm the temporary secretary for Clint." "Nevertheless, I was raised a short distance north of here. For the most of my life, I've known Brent, Jana, and Clint. While we wait for the barbecue, would it be possible for me to get a cup of coffee?" "I apologize for being aggressive," he inquired. "Without coffee, food, or even a nice note from my maid, I left Austin on a plane, and now I'm pretty much empty." She thought he seemed more like a beer man than a coffee man, so she said, "There's beer if you'd rather." He smiled, adding more wrinkles to his dark face. "Can't take the stuff," he admitted in a low voice. "I will concede, though, that I have a taste for matured scotch, but coffee is all I want right now." "So, Mr. "That's what you're going to get?" "Johnson," he answered. "Duke Johnson. You?" "Maggie." "Only Maggie?" he inquired. She gave a shrug. She informed him that in reality it's Margaretta Donahue, but no one ever calls me that. He questioned softly, "Why not? I find it rather beautiful." Under those quiet, dark eyes, she felt very young and very much out of her league. "Let us investigate that coffee." She surmised that he was a cattleman, owning a sizable ranch close to Austin, in addition to assets in real estate and oil. In addition, he was a charming man who made her feel instantly at ease. "Over a hot cup of black coffee," he informed her. "I've been overseas for about a month, in Greece." She didn't even realize the question was out. "Have you seen Pompeii?" It appeared to frighten him. "Yes, I did. That's why." "Troy, as well as the Acropolis." He inclined himself forward. "Tell me you're not an archaeology nerd, please," she said. "I read everything I can lay my hands on about new digs, and I spent my childhood climbing over Indian mounds." "God," he muttered, "it sounds like me. My father used to plow the rows, pick up pottery fragments and arrowheads, and I would follow him. I make the most of my time." "Johnson, are you tired?" A low, quiet voice spoke up from right behind Maggie. Johnson laughed. "Beat it, Clint," he said. "I flew out without having had breakfast or even a cup of instant coffee, and I only slept for 2 hours the night before." Margaretta had sympathy for me. Clint came into sight, still holding Sarah Willis by the arm. His eyes were odd and prying as he stared down at Maggie. "Margaretta?" he said inquiringly. Maggie tensed up. "That's my name." Sipping his coffee, Johnson continued, "And a very pretty one. Would you mind lending her to me for the evening, Clint? At least long enough to have company at the dinner table." Maggie was as surprised as Clint by the question. "I would love that," Maggie said without giving it much thought. "We can discuss archaeology in more detail? Bygone eras?" Clint exploded, narrowing and deepening his gaze. "How in the world are you aware of that?" She gave him a fierce look. "In actuality, quite a bit. At university, I took 2 courses in it, and last year I went on a 2-month dig." "Clint, honey, I don't see why you're so upset." With a gentle murmur, Sarah grinned at Maggie. "That kind of stuff is rare to find common between 2 persons, and just as swiftly." "Well, Clint," she said, "you and I both enjoy country western music." Johnson assured Clint, "I'll take care of her," and something in his eyes appeared to persuade the younger guy. "You seem to know me very well, don't you?" Clint finally answered in a calm, deep voice. "I do." "And that's a praise that you can accept. That's not something I could say about many males." "This is what?" Maggie scowled and gave Clint a hard look. "I'm a mature lady. I don't require a guardian." "Grown?" laughed Clint. "Is that it? 20 and you know every answer?" "However," Sarah gushed, "but Clint, I'm only 21 and you never fuss about me." "Sarah, stop talking," he commanded sternly. Maggie told him that he would never say such to her. "I would crush you like a—" Clint turned to face Sarah and drew her with him, saying, "Go to hell, Maggie." Over his shoulder, Johnson called, "Get her home by midnight. If you don't, she turns into a pumpkin." Johnson gave her a smile. He asked, observing the feelings affecting her pale face. "Do you?" she said fiercely. "I wish he would. I no longer require an older brother. I believe that you do." He examined her while folding his arms on the table. "Young lady, I am 42 years old, and you would never go outside this yard with me if Clint didn't know me personally, I promise. However, he is also aware that I have no intentions for you. All I need is company, and talking to someone who knows about carbon dating and the allure of ancient tombs is quite enjoyable." She grinned. "I'm grateful." His thick eyebrows lifted. "I'm grateful. Would you like to learn more about Pompeii now?" "Yes, that would be wonderful," she said, settling in to listen while attempting to block out Clint's final, irate remarks and ignore the hate in his gaze. When Maggie and Johnson went for the restaurant, the sale was ended and the people were leaving only bare bones where the barbecued cow carcasses had been. It was a godsend that Clint had left with Sarah. For one day, she'd had about as much battle as she could bear. Johnson smiled at the rapt expression on her young face as he recounted places she'd give worlds to see, and over a perfectly grilled steak, he shared some of his trips with her. She told him, "I've always wanted to see Stonehenge." "So why not go?" he inquired. "You know, airfares aren't all that expensive." She grinned. "I may also offer myself for a dig at any time. Just give it some time. It feels like there is never enough." For a moment, something made his eyes appear darker. "Yes, I am aware. Little daughter, don't let yours run out before you accomplish a handful of your goals." She gave a shrug. "I have an abundance." "No," he said, his eyelids ajar. "No one has an abundance of it." When Johnson pulled up in front of the ranch house in his rental car, it was midnight on the nose. "That was really enjoyable," Maggie grinned and told him. "Whenever you make it to Columbus," he remarked gently. "That's not on the books, little one." His deep brown eyes beamed at her. "I appreciate you keeping an elderly man company. You'll realize how much it meant eventually." "Man of age? You?" she questioned in disbelief. He laughed. "That was a compliment, right? Margaretta Donahue, good night. Not even a kiss good night?" With a saucy question, she asked, "I perceive an insult, you tiny minx." He drew her up against his massive, husky frame and planted a slow, hard kiss on her with a shattering level of expertise. He said, "Thank you, Maggie," and released her. She said goodnight to him as she grudgingly got out of the car. He said softly, "Goodbye, honey," and he was gone in an instant. She was briefly transported out of Florida as she watched the car's taillights as it turned around the driveway and headed toward the highway. With the drams hammering in her veins and a breeze rustling her hair, she found herself standing on the remains of an old civilization, and he was there too, but his name wasn't Johnson. She shuddered. Those black eyes had seen hers in a different place and at a different time, and now, hours away from now, his soul had reached out to meet hers. She could feel her tense body twitching with emotion. It's odd to meet someone and instantly know everything about them, like we've known them our entire lives.